All righty. Well, no sound effects were needed in the program we're going to talk about now, a little classic wrestling content. We've heard about this documentary being worked on and was scheduled for release. It is out now, it has escaped. And I was afraid because this was done by the PBS station out in North Carolina. I was afraid I was going to have to learn how to use some kind of app or whatever. And then one of the listeners was kind enough to send me a link, but come to find out, any mark can just go to pbs.org and look up When Giants Walked Here, and you can watch the whole documentary on their website. So I thought I was being given preferential treatment by this fellow, and he just sent me a link to something anybody, even you could see it, Brian.
I did see it. I saw most of it.
Even you.
Even me.
Even you. Anyway, it's a documentary on Dorton Arena in Raleigh, which may sound a little dry, until we say that it focuses primarily on wrestling was the top attraction at Dorton Arena for the first almost 30 years of its existence. Dorton Arena in Raleigh is also on the Register of Historic Places nationally. It's a worldwide, world-known architectural phenomenon because of the way it's built. It's in that parabolic curve. Brian, you know what other famous product is built just like the Dorton Arena, where the shape helps support itself from falling in a parabolic manner?
What's that?
Pringles potato chips. Think about them. Pringles in the can. When you pull them out, that's the same thing that they did to the Pringles to keep them from breaking, because it makes the structure more sturdy when they got the fucking sides up like that. I saw that on How the Food Built America.
How the Food Built America.
Yes. On the food that built America.
On the backs of food. That's how.
On the backs of food, yes. Anyway.
Hey, I thought that was actually some of the most interesting stuff was, although the historian or expert, whatever he was, may have been a bit dry, the stuff about the architecture and the history of why it was built and how it was built, I thought that was great.
Yeah, and I didn't know a lot of these things, about the building itself, but apparently, and this took quite a while during the post-World War II boom, North Carolina wanted to pave more of their roads. I can imagine what the roads looked like in the late 40s out there. And they wanted to build new buildings, and J.S. Dorton was the director of the fairgrounds, and he led the development of the arena, and they had the original plans and drawings and different sketches on what it might look like. And the architect that built it was a famous Polish architect. He settled in Raleigh, and he worked on the project. It took years between the Korean War delaying it and all that stuff. And then before they built the thing, he died in a plane crash, the architect. So the city rallied because he was a popular guy and completed the arena. In, I think the early 60s is when they opened it up, or at least when wrestling got there. But they had not only some of the wrestlers, talking heads, we'll talk about George South and Jimmy Valiant, but also some of the famous fans from the area. Brad Stutz, he was on there. John Hitchcock from Parts Unknown. Tom Sorensen was the guy that did the wrestling column in the Charlotte Observer and did a number of pieces on me and everybody in Crockett Promotions in the 80s. And Bruce Mitchell, good to see he's still fighting, man. Well, no, leprosy is a hell of a disease. And to see, he made it to the sit down and only lost a couple of fingers. It was, anyway, it's good to see, even in that kind of desiccated condition.
The last time you ever mentioned the last time you mentioned him on the show, you said he looked like he was decomposing.
Well, that's why I'm saying, they've apparently that spirit gum that they got to hold his facial skin on is working. But anyway, nice to see a picture recognition of Joe Murnick, Carl and Elliot Murnick's father, Carl and Elliot were brothers, obviously, and they were major local promoters for Jim Crockett when I was there. But their father, Joe Murnick, was partners with Jim Crockett Sr. and started the Murnicks ran everything at one point in the eastern half of North Carolina and some of the Virginia spot shows. But the thing about Dorton Arena, David Crockett was on and mentioned it. It was the biggest arena in those days in eastern North Carolina because all of the major population centers, Charlotte, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, Asheville, they're all on the western part of the state. Out east by the toward the coast, Wilmington didn't have any major arena indoors. The big shows there, wrestling shows that would draw 4,000 or 5,000 people, were outdoors in the summer at Legion Stadium. That's where Flair and Valentine and those guys were going when the plane crashed. And Greenville, North Carolina, didn't have a big building. Fayetteville, the Cumberland County Memorial Arena, seated like 4,000. So Dorton Arena in Raleigh, and Raleigh is still one of those other Tri-Cities operations over there next to Durham, and that was the big place in eastern North Carolina. And that's why, a lot of the guys that grew up there that got in the business always wanted to work there, and because it was kind of like their Mid-South Coliseum or their Omni or their Madison Square Garden. But originally, and I think probably throughout the 60s and 70s, Raleigh was a more important market for Crockett Promotions than it became in the 80s because that's when they were still running exclusively North and South Carolina and Virginia. By the time I got there, Raleigh had switched from Tuesday night to Wednesdays, and it was starting to be every week they didn't get the big card because Crockett was expanding. But for years, the Tuesday night matches were because they did TV at WRAL, which was at one time, along with, I think, WBT in Charlotte, the biggest television station in the state. And they did their studio show there on Wednesdays. So they do Tuesday night house show, Wednesday during the day interviews, and Wednesday night TV taping. But they switched Raleigh to Wednesday in the 80s when they bought the Nemo truck and started doing on-location tapings on Tuesday nights for their syndicated TV. But nevertheless, what a building to look at, and it is architecturally resplendent, but a couple of the guys mentioned it, and if you were working that fucking building, there were some conditions you needed to know about. There's no air conditioning, never was and still is not. So in the summertime, and Brian, you saw the thing that makes it such a striking visual is all the windows. It's not like a regular arena. Everywhere there above the seats all the way around is glass, is windows. And they didn't fucking make the high energy efficient windows back in the 50s. You can imagine when you'd start a show at 8 o'clock in the summertime, the sun was still shining. And it was fucking burning hot in that building. But by the same token, in the wintertime, I don't know if they had heat either. There was some in the locker rooms. It was steam heat, so you'd sweat in the locker room regardless. But in the wintertime, that building, same thing. Now it's dark, and it's fucking 35 degrees outside. You needed a fucking parka. I was wearing a suit sometimes. I was freezing to death. And it was a great building when it was full or where there was a big crowd. But if you got there and there was 1,200 people because it was just a black card, the goddamn atmosphere was death. Because it was not only was it a bigger building, but the floor area was enormous. And we had a cold World Tag title match one night with Wahoo McDaniel and Ronnie Garvin. One fall, 60-minute time limit. Tommy Young brings the finish over. This was early in 86, right? And it wasn't a big card, and there wasn't a lot of people there. He said, they won an hour Broadway. We're like, what? An hour Broadway. I swear to God, I was there at that ringside for 3 days. And at one point, they actually had to one of the baby faces, I'm pretty sure it was Garvin. Wahoo wouldn't have run that far. Had to chase me to the back so I could piss out there a fucking hour, not able to sweat because it's 40 fucking degrees.
Man.
They told the story about the locker rooms were being separate. You never saw the baby faces never saw the heels never saw the baby faces. Not only were the locker rooms separate, but they were at opposite ends of that building. And so the referees would go back and forth with finishes and spots and fucking things. And they'd be blown up by the time the show started because it was easily 500-600 feet in between fucking locker rooms by the time you came up the stairs, through the building, back down the stairs. And it was multiple times per night before the show even started.
What other buildings in the Carolinas and Virginia, the whole territory, what other buildings had separate heel and baby? What buildings didn't have separate heel and babyface dressing rooms?
The bigger buildings like Greensboro and Charlotte, you could get back and forth behind the scenes, but it wasn't encouraged because building people were wandering around. In Greensboro, it was easy because it was all closed off and, you know, etc. Richmond Coliseum, the bigger arenas, you could get back and forth if you needed to. It was the smaller places. It was the Fayettevilles. It was the Columbia, South Carolina. It was the Asheville Civic Center. You know, you could go through the catacombs of the building if you had to talk to somebody, but it generally wasn't done. So a lot of the smaller buildings were where there was probably as many or more where you could not talk to the other side as there were that you could. But we were there wasn't a lot of conferences going on anyway about the match, even if you were together, because you were working with these people every night, or you were calling it in the ring, or you had your finish. What more do you need? Every once in a while for TV, if you were taping TV in a building and there had to be some conversation about positioning or whatever, you know, there would be some neutral ground outside where each side could sneak to and be unmolested for a little while. The good thing about Dorton Arena was because it was on the fairgrounds, all around the arena in the parking lot area were these little ticket booths. And it was like, I didn't care about talking to the fucking opponents, but it was like the building, the arena was ringed by a series of small little hotel rooms. And once the matches started and all the fans were in their seats, if you needed to meet someone, to have a private discussion of non-wrestling events, these fucking little ticket booths were perfect. It was like a little roadside motel room and a boom, and there you go. Did that answer your question?
What was my question?
It was about people getting together to talk.
Oh, yes, yes.
People got together in those things, but no, there wasn't a lot of talking going on. But Earl Hebner and Jimmy Valiant, Bobby Fulton, some of those guys are quoted in this piece. That was at Dorton Arena, was the building, nobody mentioned this, where Piper got stabbed. And that's what predicated his babyface switch of the Carolinas, when he got stabbed by the guy in the fucking hallway in Raleigh at Dorton Arena. That was the building and they showed the clip of it. Baby Doll knocked me out with the punch to the base of the skull that night when she was late because it was so far coming from the locker room to the ring. I had to run 2 laps around the fucking ring.
Because she hated you and she wanted to punch you as hard as she could after you were blown up is what it was.
Well, it certainly felt like it.
The crowd going crazy. I mean, that's a great shot too, because it's from ringside and people go nuts when she hits you.
And that was
you fall to Bubba's feet.
Yes, in a very convincing fashion. But that was the biggest crowd or the biggest gate, I should say, in the history of Raleigh. But they did highlight, and I got to bring something up here. And everybody knows I loved Buddy Landel. Bless his little pea-picking heart. But when they brought Buddy in to be Nature Boy Buddy Landel, put him with J.J. Dillon in the Carolinas, that's when Flair to the home territory people was a babyface. Flair was still as world champion, a heel everywhere else, but he had become a babyface to Carolinas. And so Landel comes in, and they have the Battle of the Nature Boys, and that was, again, what Buddy was proud of to his dying day and was a big story. They sold out Dorton Arena in July of '85 for Flair versus Landel in a Battle of the Nature Boys in a thunderstorm. That's how much interest was in. They had a match in Greensboro, and they were going to do, more in the future. But then when George South told the story, and I'm not blaming George South, because Buddy Landel told him this story, and Buddy could tell a very convincing story. But Buddy told George, and George said, well, Flair was tired. He needed to spend more time with his family. He was going to take time off. Buddy was going to get the belt and run for, I think, a couple of years. But it didn't happen because then poor Brad Stutz said the next TV taping after this sellout was when Buddy overslept in Atlanta. Yeah, it was about 4 or 5 months later.
Oh, my favorite is Jimmy Valiant. Like, oh no, Buddy. No, I knew what he was going to do. What was he going to do? He's going to party like everyone else does.
Yes. He's
you didn't know he was going to oversleep.
Stay with me, brother. I got an extra. No, Buddy was riding with Joel Deaton, Thunderfoot. Joel Deaton of the Wild Bunch in Japan, at All Japan years ago. And Joel went to bed and Buddy went out. And Buddy came back in while Joel was asleep, and Joel got up to go to TV, and Buddy, get up. And then the phone calls came from TBS, from JJ, and whatever the fuck. And finally, Buddy draggled in about noon and got himself fired. But the point is, nobody was never going to be the NWA World Champion at that juncture. I'm not saying there wasn't much more NWA World Champion to be had in 1985. By 89, 90 was over with, but that wasn't the time. Can you imagine if Buddy Landel had been the NWA World Champion from fall 85 for a couple years till maybe fall 87? Well, nothing really historic in wrestling went on between 1985 and 87 that Flair needed to be around for.
Yeah, the idea that Flair would one off in the middle of the wrestling war with Vince.
Yes, and 1986 would be the biggest year of business that Jim Crockett Promotions ever did.
There were two faces of wrestling, Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
And Flair wanted to go spend more time with his family, so Buddy was going to get the world title and have it for a few years, which means he would have turned back Magnum TA, maybe Barry Windham if things still happen and he comes in, Nikita Koloff. It would have been Buddy with JJ instead of Flair with JJ. Buddy was with JJ. Different horsemen altogether. You want to talk about the horseman getting into trouble? There's a horseman that will get in trouble, the Buddy Landel-led horseman.
Boy, howdy. The thing is, JJ was with Buddy, and the whole thing with JJ and Tully came after Buddy overslept. So part of that possibly would have happened. But anyway, again, not knocking George South. He told a story. Buddy told it to him. It's a good story. Doesn't stand up to independent scrutiny. But anyway, when Crockett expanded, he's running more shows, he's running more towns, they started neglecting the Carolinas somewhat. As I said, like by 1986, you could tell there were starting to be some chips because again, not only did Buddy and Rick sell the place out in 85, but when we did that big TV taping with the Midnight and the Warriors, and I think it was Flair and the Horsemen against Dusty and the Superpowers or the Road Warriors or whatever on top, that was $74,000 and sold out in 1986. That it would be the equivalent of about what, almost $250,000 house in today's money. And that wasn't even a Great American Bash date. That was just a loaded card in Raleigh at that point. But on some of the other weeks, you'd have the Midnight versus Wahoo and Ronnie in a cold match for the title, and you'd have 1,200 people. And that was the year they started kind of neglecting Greenville, South Carolina. that had been one of their major markets. In 1986, Greenville, for 40 wrestling events, grossed $600,000. By 1988, you could barely get 1,000 people in a fucking building. So, and by the way, 600 grand, almost 40 years later, that Greenville, South Carolina was the equivalent of a $2 million a year town for Crockett, and it was one of his B towns. So that was, anyway, that was what started the chink in the armor. And then when Turner Broadcasting bought the thing in 88, most of the Carolinas towns went dark. And the fans got pissed. They wanted to run the big cities. They wanted to run Los Angeles and Dallas and this and that. And the big cities didn't draw what the Carolinas towns did. Then when they tried to go back to the Carolinas towns, the fans were like, oh, fuck you. Now you need us. This was ours. You took it away from us. Remember, I told a story when I said, why did you book Greensboro on a fucking Wednesday night? I was at a production meeting. I was asking Pedicino, who was working in the office then. He said, well, they wanted to save Saturday nights for, the big markets. I said, what is bigger than Greensboro? And I got my books out and I showed him how Greensboro over the last year had outdrawn St. Louis and Chicago and this town and that town. And then he said, well, I didn't realize that. I said, you people are working in a fucking office. I'm digging in my wrestling bag. I've got access to records you don't fucking have. Am I getting off on a tangent here?
No, it's part of the story.
So, but that's what they did.
Because we've heard that obviously a lot. Mostly you hear about it from fans that used to go to shows in Greensboro, that they felt ripped off. Starrcade got ripped away from them, and booking issues. And next thing you know, what was the strongest market, Greensboro, was gone.
Well, Raleigh, think about Raleigh in 1977. They're seeing Ric Flair and Greg Valentine versus the Anderson brothers, plus Piper and Andre and Snuka and Steamboat. And in 1987, they're seeing the Cruel Connection in the semifinal match or whatever. They did the same thing with all the Carolinas towns that per capita drew more than most other wrestling markets in the country because they thought they wanted to go to the big towns. So then they had a picture. 1985 sold out. 1993, there's not 1,000 people in there. It was WCW's last show in the building.
There's been footage over the years of Ric Flair, not too long ago, saying things like, if Crockett Promotions had just stayed in the Carolinas, they never would have gone out of business. It's not necessarily that simple, but were there people at the time, as it was happening, advocating for not traveling to Chicago, LA, St. Louis? Like, as it was happening in real time, were there people saying, why don't we just stay here in these towns?
Yeah, a couple of them were named Crockett. David, David tried to talk Jimmy out of selling when the business started resurging and coming back in 88. And David admitted in this, well, we thought we were invincible and, we got a little too big for our britches, paraphrasing. But it would have been very difficult for Jim Crockett Promotions had they stayed in the Carolinas and on the eastern seaboard where they were established and could draw from Chicago over to Baltimore and Philadelphia and the Carolinas in the southeast and add Georgia to that. They wouldn't have been, they had the national television, so they would have been a presence. They wouldn't have been as competitive with Vince for the 84 to 87 period that they were, but they would have been healthier financially by not spending the money to expand the TV network and expand the live events and absorb all those promotions that Kansas City, Florida, Mid-South, UWF, whatever. So eventually, Vince may have still taken over the entire country for wrestling, but it would be hard to figure how that Jim Crockett Promotions and wrestling in the Carolinas couldn't exist in some form, regardless of what. Maybe they wouldn't have kept Ric Flair, but maybe Flair would have run with Vince and then come back because he didn't want to move out of the fucking Carolinas. Vince didn't eat up every single piece of talent that would have supplied a secondary promotion with a lot of good talent from 88 to 98. Company under TBS was being run, and the fact that TBS eliminated all of the markets that their wrestling show could go to, that it was proven that it was popular, that it was more over than anything else. They either didn't run them or they watered the product down so bad to look like Vince's that the people in those markets didn't want to go see it anymore.
That's the problem. Eventually, everything was chasing Vince.
Yes. And, so you did something that somebody else is doing, but not as good, instead of doing something completely different than anybody else was doing that was already successful. So they have mismanagement on different levels. Crockett just got too big, too fast, and took bad advice. TBS disrupted and dismembered the whole goddamn thing and made it something completely different that nobody wanted to see for years and years. But there you have it. And then finally, in 2016, Big Time Wrestling ran. I was on that show. They ran Spartanburg the night before. Baby Doll beat me up. And then that night in Raleigh, Jimmy Valiant spanked me with my tennis racket. But it was fun to go back. But I've done that now. I don't need to go back anymore.
I just love Jimmy Valiant retelling the story of trying to beg Buddy Landel to not go out.
And now here's the thing. Imagine Jimmy in his day was not the best influence on anybody, but he would have been a better influence than probably most of the people that Buddy Landel were hanging around with.
Oh, brother, stay in. Get a glass table. Oh, maybe that's not a good idea for you. Get a table.
No, wait. See, that was Klondike Bill's gimmick, and somehow it got hung on Jimmy Valiant. I don't know how.
Someone recently emailed us about that story, and they said they asked him about it. I don't know how it comes up at a convention. Probably because Jimmy's trying to sell something. And Jimmy was like, no, man, it's not true at all. It's not true at all. It was the Midnight Express.
Hey, no, come on now.
Not the rock and roll, but the Midnight Express.
No, I'll tell you what, though. Klondike Bill, and he's gone now, and he had a lovely wife, and I'm sure she would have to be 120 years old right now. But Klondike Bill was known in the business even after his wrestling days were over with and he got into his ring hauling days. Not only was he the undisputed NWA World Pussy Eating Champion, but he had a record going that he had scored with more hotel maids in the Carolinas than any other living human. And those glass top coffee tables would come into play that they had in those roadside motels back in those days.
And somehow
that's all I can say.
And you're saying somehow that got attributed to Jimmy Valiant?
Well, I'd heard it from Klondike Bill's own lips, but I never even suspectified it about Handsome Jimmy. And suddenly, it seems like it's just too similar a story.
By the way, is the story that Big Mama's doing it, or just that it's a generic woman?
No, it's just a generic one of the. Well, it depends on whether it's number one or number two, depending on the story.
It was shit. I'm pretty sure the story was shit.
Well, it started out with the P.
I don't know.
And
that.
then, but P rhymes with
heard? Hold on, we're getting
capital
details.
P, which rhymes with T, and that stands for trouble.
We're getting details we've never heard before here now.
Well, no, that's the way the story was told to me by Klondike Bill. That you could lay under the table, and if she peed on the table, it made interesting geometric designs.
Just like the Dorton Arena.
Yes, like it's parabolic.
They wanted it to be this state-of-the-art arena. Why didn't you put it in an air conditioner? That would have been state-of-the-art.
Well, now, but we're talking about mid-50s when they were putting this thing together. Air conditioning wasn't widespread at that point, some places down south.
In state-of-the-art buildings from the architect who designed the United Nations, I think they would know a little bit about it.
Well, he was Polish too now.
Right?
Well, you never know about them Polish.
You stop. You see, you can't do that. That's not nice.
We can't tell jokes about them anymore either.
No, all jokes are out. All jokes have to be about objects. Like, hey, look at this frying pan. Hey, look at this. I have a bottle on my desk. Like that. That's the kind
How
of
many
jokes.
frying pans does it take to change a light bulb in Dorton Arena?
How many?
3 glass tables.
How many union guys does it take to change a light bulb at Madison Square Garden?
I don't think they've hired them all yet.
25. You got a problem?
You know, where was it? We were in Atlantic City, that big convention building, right? For a WWF taping. The Raw.
Hall.
Yeah, they did a Raw there one time, right? And we go up, and the place was built in the goddamn Ulysses Grant administration, it looks like. And we go up to this big room that we're going to have this production meeting in, and there aren't enough chairs. So I think I told Jerry Briscoe, I said, I'll go down and get us a couple of chairs. So I'm walking down, a guy said, oh, you can't do that. It's a union building. I said, what do you mean? He said, you got to have the union people bring the chair. I said, a chair for me and my friend to sit in. No, they got to be the one carrying the chairs. I said, well, tell them to get their fucking ass up here with some chairs because I'm tired. Well, I stood there for about 5 or 6 minutes and no chairs materialized. So I walked my goddamn ambulatory, able-bodied ass down the stairs and picked up 3 fucking chairs. One for me, one for Jerry Briscoe, and an extra one just to be neighborly. And I walked right past that fucking guy on the way up when I was carrying him. And I said, your union guys ain't quick enough. And they went and complained. Yeah, there was a guy carrying chairs over there. And somebody, probably Jim Ross, came, were you carrying chairs? I said, yes. And I'm sitting in the chair I was carrying and Jerry's sitting in the other one. And if that guy don't like it, I'm willing to go home right now and forget this whole fucking show. And then we had our meeting and I don't know what happened to the guy with the fucking chair fetish.
Was that the trip to Atlantic City where they destroyed was it Atlantic City where they destroyed your windshield?
No, yes. Wait a minute now. God damn it. Is there another resort type place with a big building in New Jersey?
Resort at that time?
Well, you know what I'm saying, on the beach or with things going on.
I mean, Wildwood, but I don't think they were running Raw.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Yeah, as a matter of fact, then yes, Raw in Atlantic City, the big old building. That was the same night they broke my fucking windshield.
There it is. That was the barter to get the union not to kill you. They let them destroy your car.
You know, that might be a good time to close the program, Brian.
Well, death usually is a good way to end the show. Swami's barking. But overall, what did you think of the Dorton Arena? Like, how would you grade it?
No, it was good. It's nice to see, again, a documentary on something, the old days, that doesn't come with an agenda, not history written by the winner. The WWF has to make a snide remark, or, just the old plethora of blah, blah that we've seen before. This is very different. So I enjoyed it. PBS.org, When Giants Walked Here, about the love affair, and it was a love affair that the fans in Eastern North Carolina had with wrestling for so many years until the wrestling people screwed it all up.